The morning they told her she was getting married, Pelumi was scrubbing the veranda tiles on her knees. She heard her stepmother's slippers before she saw them, that particular slap, slap, slap of expensive leather that Iyabo always wore, even indoors, as if she were perpetually walking into a room she owned, which, in this house, she was. "Leave that," Iyabo said. "Come and sit down. We have a matter to discuss." Pelumi rose slowly, wiping her hands on the wrapper tied at her waist. 6 years she had lived under this roof since her father died, and in 6 years, "we have a matter to discuss" had never once meant anything good. In the parlor, her stepsisters were already seated. Tolu on the good sofa with her legs crossed, scrolling her phone. Bisi standing by the window, arms folded, wearing the small, satisfied smile she wore when something was about to happen to Pelumi and not to her. Their father's photograph still hung above the television, though nobody looked at it anymore. Pelumi sometimes thought she was the only one who still did. "Sit," Iyabo said again, gesturing to the wooden stool by the door. "Never the sofa, never in 6 years." Pelumi sat. "You know Chief Balogun," Iyabo began. "The building contractor," Pelumi said. "Yes. His nephew is Darius Obi. He has agreed to marry you." The room went very quiet. Even Tolu looked up from her phone. Pelumi blinked. "Agreed to marry me, Mama? I don't know this man. I have never—" "You will know him soon enough." Iyabo's voice was flat, businesslike, the voice she used when she had already decided something and was only informing you of the decision, not asking your opinion of it. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. Chief Balogun's family is paying for everything. You will not lift one finger." 3 weeks? Pelumi's voice cracked. "Mama, please, at least let me meet him first. Let me—" "You have met him," Bisi cut in from the window. And there it was again, that smile, wider now. "The blind man, remember? The one who sat in the parlor for 2 hours and Mama made you serve him tea because your hands were steadier." Pelumi's stomach dropped. She remembered. A quiet man, dark glasses, a walking stick resting against his knee, hands folded politely in his lap while he waited for someone she never learned the name of. She had served the tea carefully, guided his fingers to the cup so he wouldn't spill it, and he had thanked her, softly, precisely, in a voice that didn't match the rest of the room's carelessness towards her. "He's blind," Pelumi said slowly, looking at her stepmother. "You are marrying me to a blind man." "He is blind, yes." Iyabo did not blink. "And he has no family of his own worth mentioning. An orphan, raised by relations, works some small job doing something I don't know with computers. Chief Balogun is only doing this as a favor to an old friend, getting the boy settled before something happens to him. Nobody serious was going to marry him. So," she spread her hands, as if she were being generous, "we are helping you and we are helping him." Tolu laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Imagine now, Pelumi, always thinking she's too good to serve anybody, and now you'll spend the rest of your life serving one man who can't even see you do it." "That's enough," Iyabo said. She was smiling too, the corner of her mouth twitching with something she didn't bother to hide. "It's decided, Pelumi. Go and start preparing. There is a lot to do before 3 weeks. What none of them mentioned, what Pelumi wouldn't learn until much later, was the phone call Iyabo had received 2 days earlier. Chief Balogun's voice, warm and persuasive on the other end. "Iyabo, my sister, do this for me and you will not regret it. My nephew needs a wife nobody will ask questions about. Quiet family, no money behind her, nowhere else to run to if things go badly. Pelumi is perfect. I will make it worth your family's while." Pelumi sat on the wooden stool for a long moment after they had all filed out of the room, laughing about something else already, the matter closed as far as they were concerned. She looked up at her father's photograph on the wall. "You would never have allowed this," she thought, "but you are not here, and I have nowhere else to go." She thought of the man from last month, the careful way he'd held the teacup, a thank you that sounded like he meant it, rarer than it should have been in that house. It was a small thing to hold on to, but it was the only thing she had. They planned the wedding the way you plan a punishment. No real guest list, a few of Iyabo's church friends, invited mainly so they could witness and report back on Pelumi's humiliation. No new gown for the bride, though Tolu and Bisi both got new outfits to represent the family well. The reception, as it were, would be held in the small hall behind Chief Balogun's compound, not even in the main house. "Don't worry," Bisi told her 3 days before the wedding, dropping a plain white dress on her bed. Plain, ill-fitting, clearly bought off a rack without her measurements. Pelumi said nothing. She had learned that silence cost her less than argument. She had no secret to hold on to this time, no private knowledge to armor herself with, only the memory of a stranger's careful hands around a teacup and the small, foolish hope that a man who said thank you like he meant it might somehow turn out to be more than what her family had promised her. The wedding day came grey and ordinary. Pelumi wore the ill-fitting dress. Her stepmother didn't cry, didn't fuss over her, didn't do any of the things she had watched other mothers do for other daughters. She simply looked her over once, the way you'd check a delivery against a receipt, and said, "Good, at least you won't embarrass us." At the small hall behind Chief Balogun's compound, Darius Obi stood at the front. Dark glasses, dark suits, the same walking stick from before resting near his hand, though he stood without leaning on it. He turned his head slightly at the sound of her approach, and something in his face, not his eyes, but the set of his mouth, softened. "Pelumi," he said quietly as she reached him, "I remember your voice, and your hands were steady that day with the tea." "You remember that?" she whispered. "I remember everyone who is kind to me without being asked to be. There are few of you than you think." Near the back of the hall, a man Pelumi didn't recognize stood watching the ceremony with his arms crossed and no expression at all. Tall, well-dressed, clearly not one of Iyabo's church friends. He didn't clap when the pastor pronounced them married. He simply turned and left before the reception food was even served. Pelumi noticed him only because everyone else in the hall was noticing something about her. He was the only person in the hall not looking at her. He was looking at Darius. You didn't know his name was Ayo, or that he was Chief Balogun's son, or that he had spent the last 8 years of his life waiting for exactly this wedding never to happen. Behind them, Iyabo was already whispering to her church friends, not troubling to lower her voice much. "Poor girl. Well, someone has to take him. At least it's not one of my real daughters wasting away on a blind pauper." Pelumi felt Darius's hand find hers, steady, sure despite his blindness, and hold her. If he heard, he gave no sign at all. The car that came to collect them after the small, sour reception was not what Pelumi expected. It was black, long and silent in the particular way that only very expensive things are silent. And the driver, a broad, quiet man named Emeka, held the door for her like she was something precious. "This is Chief Balogun's car," Pelumi asked, settling into the seat beside Darius. "No," Darius said, "it's mine. Nothing you'll see tonight belongs to my uncle. Remember that, whatever else happens." She didn't understand the weight in his voice yet. She simply nodded and watched the city lights slide past and told herself it must be a hired car arranged for one night only, the way even poor families sometimes borrow dignity for an occasion. The house, when they arrived, took her breath away in a way that she didn't have room to feel yet. High walls, quiet gardens, a home lit warm against the dark. She assumed, standing in the doorway, that it belonged to some relative of Chief Balogun's, lent out of pity for the night. Darius didn't correct her, not yet. Inside, a woman in her 50s came to greet them, wiping her hands on an apron. "Madam Ngozi," Darius said, "this is my wife, Pelumi." "Oh, thank God, finally," Ngozi said, beaming, taking both of Pelumi's hands. Come, let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted." Your room, not her room. Pelumi noticed it, filed it away without asking, too tired and too unsteady with everything the day had asked of her to question a kindness she hadn't expected. Later, alone with him for the first time on the wide veranda overlooking the dark garden, she sat very still, her hands folded tight in her lap, waiting. For what? She wasn't entirely sure, only that 6 years in Iyabo's house had taught her that things were expected of her in rooms like this, and that fear was simply the price of not knowing yet what those things were. Darius seemed to hear it in her silence, the way he seemed to hear everything. "You don't have to share a room with me," he said quietly. "Tonight or any night, until you are ready, if you are ever ready.
I won't ask you for anything you haven't chosen to give me first. Pelumi's breath caught. Why would you say that? Because I imagine you've spent a great deal of your life having things decided for you. Not in my own house, not on our first night as anything. She sat with that for a long moment, something in her chest loosening that had been drawn tight for 6 years. Thank you, she said, very softly. You already thanked me once, with tea and steady hands. I told you. I remember. She didn't sleep in his room that night, but she slept for a long time longer than she could remember, without dreading the morning.
The weeks that followed built themselves quietly, in small rituals rather than grand gestures. Each morning, Pelumi read him his correspondence over breakfast, letters, notices, the newspaper, because his assistant usually handled the more technical documents, but he said he preferred her voice in the mornings, unhurried, without an agenda. She didn't understand half of what she read him. Numbers, dates, formal names of companies she didn't recognize. He listened to all of it with the same quiet attention, occasionally asking her to reread a line, and never once explained why it mattered. Most evenings, they walked the garden together, her hand resting lightly at his elbow, more from habit than necessity. Darius navigated the ground with an ease that made her wonder sometimes whether he needed guiding at all or simply liked the company of it. He was kind to her in 100 small, unannounced ways that had nothing to do with money. He asked her opinion on things and waited for the actual answer. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. Their friendship grew the way good things usually do. Slowly, without either of them marking the exact day, it became something neither of them could easily name. But there were other things Pelumi noticed too. Things she filed away without yet having a place to put them. Visitors came to the house with a strange, inconsistent weather to their manners. Some, mostly older men, some in expensive suits, spoke to Darius with a deference that startled her, waiting for him to finish a sentence before they dared respond, calling him sir with a weight that felt entirely wrong, for a man everyone had told her was a burden nobody else wanted. Others, usually people passing through briefly, spoke to him the way people speak to the blind when they think kindness and pity are the same thing. Slow, over loud, addressing Pelumi instead of him, as though he weren't in the room. She noticed she disliked the second kind intensely, before she ever asked herself why she cared. Phone calls came at odd hours, drivers arriving to collect documents in locked cases, a lawyer visiting twice in a week, someone addressing him once briefly through the receiver as chairman, before Darius stepped out onto the veranda and lowered his voice too far for her to follow the rest. Who exactly is this man? She found herself wondering more than once, watching him from the kitchen doorway as Emeka held the car door for a visitor who bowed slightly on his way out. But she didn't ask. Some instinct, the same one that had kept her silent through 6 years in Ayobo's house, told her that when he was ready to tell her, he would. What Pelumi didn't know was that Darius had, quietly, arranged a test of his own. It wasn't cruelty, it was simply the habit of a man who had once trusted the wrong person completely and paid for it with his sight. A man who had learned in the years since never to hand anyone his whole trust without first understanding what they do with a piece of it. He asked his lawyer, a woman named Chidema who had been with him since before the accident, to arrange it discreetly. A stranger, someone with no visible connection to Darius, would approach Pelumi and offer her money. Not much at first, just enough to seem plausible. In exchange, small information. His moods, his schedule, whether he kept documents at the house and where. To make the test sharper, truer, Chidema framed it as though it came from Ayobo's side, a family friend claiming to represent her stepmother's interests, suggesting that a little information passed along quietly could smooth things over between Pelumi and the family she'd left behind. It was, Darius reasoned privately, the version of the test that actually mattered. Not whether she could resist a stranger, whether she could resist doing it for family, the one loyalty that cost her the most and been repaid the least. Pelumi refused before the woman had even finished the offer.
"Tell whoever sent you," she said, standing at the gate, "that I don't need my stepmother's approval anymore, and I would never sell my husband's privacy to buy it back." She didn't mention it to Darius that night. It genuinely hadn't occurred to her that it was significant. Only one more small, unpleasant thing to set aside and not dwell on, the way she'd set aside unpleasant things her whole life. Chidema reported it back to Darius word for word. He sat with it a long time alone in his study, turning the words over. "I don't need my stepmother's approval anymore. I would never sell my husband's privacy to buy it back." He had tested people before. Most eventually found a price. She hadn't even recognized there was a test to fail. This is the one, he thought, the only person in this whole arrangement who was never for sale and doesn't even know it about herself yet. The near miss came first. Pelumi was reading him a letter one morning, dense with clauses, unfamiliar words like shareholder and quarterly disbursement, when Emeka appeared in the doorway to say a call had come through urgent from Lagos. Darius excused himself and through the study door left slightly ajar. Her caught fragments of a voice on speakerphone. "The board is waiting on your signature before the close of market, sir. We can't move without you." She stood frozen in the hallway for a moment, the letter still in her hand, a cold and unplaceable thing moving through her. Then the door clicked closed the rest of the way, and the moment passed, and she told herself, as she told herself a dozen small times before, that it wasn't her business to wonder. The real reveal came 11 days later, and it came the way truth usually does in a house full of people trying to hide it, sideways and all at once. A man arrived unannounced mid-morning when Darius was in the garden and Pelumi was crossing the hall with a tray of tea. The man didn't wait to be announced. He simply saw Darius through the open doors and called out with the easy confidence of someone who had said the words 1,000 times before. "Good morning, Chairman. The board sent me ahead. They're hoping to move the meeting up if you are able." Pelumi stopped in the doorway, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. "Chairman," she repeated quietly to no one. Ngozi, passing behind her with a stack of linens, paused just long enough to say, gently, as if she'd been waiting months for someone to finally ask, "Madam, you didn't know? My Oga owns Obi Renewables, the whole company, has done since before I started working here." That evening, on the same veranda where he'd once told her she didn't owe him anything, Pelumi sat across from her husband and asked the only question that mattered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Darius was quiet for a long moment, his hands very still in his lap. "Because I wanted the first thing you saw in me to be a man, not a fortune." "You let me believe you are poor," she said, but there was no real anger in it, only something aching and unresolved. "I let the world believe it," he said, "because the world is unkind to a rich man's weaknesses and unbearable to a rich man's enemies. But I never lied to you about anything that mattered. Everything I gave you, the first night, the mornings, the garden, none of that had anything to do with money. I wanted you to have that uncomplicated before you ever had to hold it next to everything else you'd find out about me." Pelumi looked at him a long moment, really looked, the dark glasses catching a thin line of moonlight, the careful stillness of a man who had learned to hold his whole self quiet as a form of protection. "I'm not upset that you are rich," she said slowly. "I'm trying to understand why a man with all of this still needed to hide from a blind pauper's life." "Both things are true at once," Darius said. "I'll tell you everything, but because you finally found out about the money, because you've earned the rest of it on your own terms, the same way you earned everything else here without me handing it to you."
Ayo Balogun came to the house 11 days after the reveal, unannounced, driving a car nearly as expensive as Darius's own. Pelumi was in the garden with Ngozi when Emeka came to find her, his usual calm face pulled tight with something like worry. "Madam, Oga Ayo is here. He's asking for Master Darius, but Master Darius is on a call with Lagos. I don't like leaving him waiting in the good parlor alone, if I'm honest with you." "Who is Ayo?" Pelumi asked, though something in her had already begun to guess. Ngozi's mouth thinned. "Chief Balogun's son, his only child. That man is trouble in a nice suit, madam. Trust me. I've worked in this house 6 years, and every time he comes here, something afterward goes wrong. Pelumi found him in the parlor, standing rather than sitting, examining a framed photograph on the wall. Darius as a young man, sighted, laughing, standing beside a woman Pelumi didn't recognize. She would learn later from Ngozi that it was Darius's mother, dead a decade now. Ayo, Pelumi realized, had chosen to wait in the one room in the house that held her. "You must be the wife," he said, without turning around. His voice was pleasant, cultured, the voice of a man used to being underestimated as harmless. "Pelumi, is it? My father speaks of you like some kind of charity case he rescued from poverty. I find that funny, honestly, given how this all actually happened." "I don't believe we've met properly," Pelumi said carefully. "No, we haven't." He turned to face her now, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes at all. "Let me save us both some time, since my cousin is busy pretending Lagos calls take priority over family. I'll be direct with you, wife to cousin. You've married into a great deal of money that is not going to stay in this house forever. Darius has no children, no living parents, and frankly, no real family besides my father and me. When something happens to him, and something eventually happens to every man, blind or not, that money reverts to us. That's how the trust is structured. That's how it's been structured for 8 years." "Why are you telling me this?" Pelumi asked, her voice steady, though her pulse wasn't. "Because I'd like us to understand each other early," Ayo said. "You seem like a sensible girl. Poor family, no real options, no lawyer of your own, I would imagine. I could make your life very comfortable if you are willing to encourage my cousin towards certain decisions about his estate, about who really deserves to inherit what he's built." "I think you should leave," she said quietly, "before my husband finishes his call and finds out what you just said to his wife in his own parlor." Something flickered across Ayo's face. Not fear, not yet, but the first small crack of a man realizing his usual approach wasn't landing the way it always had. "You'll think about it," he said, recovering his smile, moving towards the door. "They always do, eventually." He was wrong, but it would take Pelumi and Darius only a few weeks to learn exactly how far Ayo, and soon others, were willing to go to make sure of it. That night, Pelumi told Darius everything Ayo had said word for word, watching his face carefully as she spoke. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at the mention of the trust, the estate, the word reverts. When he finished, he was quiet for a long time. "There's a locked room in this house I haven't shown you yet," he said finally. "I think it's time." He led her to a small study off the library, a room Ngozi wasn't even permitted to clean unsupervised, and opened a drawer with a key he kept on a chain around his neck, not trusted to any household ring. 8 years ago, he began, I ran Obi Renewables with my late father's original partner before he passed and left me controlling shares. My uncle, Chief Balogun, had been trying for years to get a foothold in the company through contracts, favors, small percentages here and there. I kept refusing him because I'd seen what he did to smaller partners who trusted him, cut them out slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to protect. The accident, Pelumi said quietly. There was no accident, Darius said, his voice very steady, very controlled. There was a car. My driver at the time, not Emeka, someone before him, was paid to lose control on a stretch of road I knew I traveled every Thursday. I survived. My sight didn't. The doctors called it a tragic accident. I have never once believed that. You can't prove it, Pelumi said slowly. I couldn't then. I was recovering, learning to live in the dark, grieving a version of myself I'd never get back. My uncle used that grief beautifully, arrived at my hospital bed like the concerned family member, positioned himself as my guardian in all but name while I was too broken to notice what he was actually doing. He restructured parts of the company's trust while I signed documents I couldn't read, trusting a man who'd nearly killed me to read them honestly to me instead. His jaw tightened. It took me 3 years to understand what he'd done. It's taken me 5 more to quietly undo it, piece by piece, without him noticing how much ground he'd already lost. That's why I've stayed out of public life. As long as the world believes I'm a fragile, dependent man my uncle generously looks after, he underestimates me. And a man who underestimates you hands you all the time in the world to work against him. Pelumi sat with that for a long moment, pieces settling into place. He didn't just want a wife who'd be grateful and quiet, she said slowly. He wanted someone with no family standing behind her, someone Ayo could threaten with no consequences and buy off if threats didn't work. Yes, Darius said. My uncle suggested your family specifically because Ayobo has a reputation, even in this town, for making decisions about people rather than with them. He thought he was choosing you the way he chose a piece of furniture, cheap, convenient, unlikely to complain. You are wrong, Pelumi said. You are wrong, Darius agreed, and for the first time that night, he smiled. He handed me the one person in this entire situation who was never for sale. Ayo's already found that out once, standing in my own parlor. He'll try again, probably with more help this time. He was right.
3 months into the marriage, Iyabo found out who her son-in-law really was, not from Pelumi, but at church, the way most true things in that neighborhood eventually surfaced. Sister Grace Adeyemi came rushing over after service, practically vibrating. Iyabo, is it true? Your daughter, the one you gave to Chief Balogun's blind nephew, my husband's company just signed a haulage contract with Obi Renewables. He says the owner is called Darius Obi. Is that the same Darius Obi? By the time Iyabo got home, her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her handbag at the door. It took the family less than a week to move from shock to strategy, and less than 2 for that strategy to find its way to Ayo Balogun, who received Iyabo's first phone call with the delighted disbelief of a man discovering an unexpected ally. You're telling me, Ayo said slowly, over a drink he didn't need, that the girl grew up in your house, that you know her habits, her weaknesses, who she trusts. I raised her, Iyabo said, which was not strictly true, but felt true enough to say aloud. Then, perhaps, Ayo said, we should stop working against each other and start working together. My father structured Darius's trust years ago. There are conditions in it around his capacity, his well-being that could be activated if enough people with standing came forward concerned about how the marriage came to be. A stepmother voicing worry that her daughter was pressured into a manipulative arrangement with a vulnerable blind man. A cousin equally concerned corroborating it. It wouldn't need to be true, it would only need to be believable enough to freeze the trust while it's reviewed. Iyabo, Tolu, and Bisi met with Ayo and Chief Balogun twice more over the following weeks in a private room at the back of a hotel restaurant, refining a plan that required Iyabo to sign a sworn statement claiming that Pelumi had confided in her tearfully about being controlled and isolated by her husband, and required Tolu and Bisi to be ready, if asked, to say they'd witnessed signs of distress during a visit that in fact had never taken place. What none of them knew, what Pelumi and Darius had quietly suspected since Ayo's visit to the parlor and had spent weeks patiently arranging to confirm, was that Chidinma, the same lawyer who had once tested Pelumi's loyalty on Darius's behalf, had a contact in the hotel's events booking office. A private room reserved under Chief Balogun's name 3 times in 1 month was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet from a man who had spent 5 years learning exactly how to watch his uncle without being seen watching him. Darius didn't warn them. He let them keep planning. They think they are building a case against us, he told Pelumi one evening on the veranda. What they are actually doing is putting every piece of their conspiracy in writing in one room in front of people I can reach. You are letting them walk into it, Pelumi said. I'm letting them walk into exactly what they think is a private room. Chidinma has already arranged for their third meeting to be recorded properly, legally, with the hotel's own consent as the property owner. My uncle taught me that lesson himself 8 years ago at my hospital bed. Let people believe they are the ones in control, right until it stops mattering that they believed it. The third meeting at the hotel was meant to finalize the statements, Iyabo's sworn account, Tolu and Bisi's corroborating stories, Ayo's legal framework for freezing the trust for Darius's own protection. Chief Balogun arrived last, satisfied, already speaking as though the matter was settled. He never got the chance to file a single document. 2 days later, Darius stood before the quarterly meeting of contractors and investors that Chief Balogun had depended on for every remaining piece of his business, the very room where his reputation as a reliable, trustworthy elder statesman of the industry had been built over 30 years. Pelumi sat beside him. He laid it out calmly, without raising his voice once. The rerouted trust document from 8 years ago, the driver since located and willing finally to speak, and now, freshly, the recording from the hotel, Chief Balogun's own voice and his sons and Iyabo's discussing in careful detail how to fabricate a story of coercion and isolation against a woman none of them had ever protected in order to seize control of money none of them had ever earned. The room, full of men who had done business with Chief Balogun for decades, went silent in a way money rooms rarely do. I'm not here to destroy my family, Darius said into that silence. I'm here to make sure every one of you understands exactly who you've been trusting your contract to so that you can make your own decisions accordingly. What you do with this information is yours to decide. I've simply decided I'm done protecting people who try to take my site, my company, and now my wife's name, and nearly succeeded at all three. He didn't need to do more than that. By the following month, 3 of Chief Balogun's remaining largest contracts were quietly, politely reassigned elsewhere. Ayo, facing the real possibility of fraud charges over the fabricated statement, accepted a quiet settlement that stripped him of any remaining claim to Darius's trust in exchange for the matter never reaching a courtroom. Chief Balogun humiliated in the one arena his professional reputation that had ever truly mattered to him, retreated from public business life entirely within the year. Iyabo received a different kind of letter, not from a court, but from Darius's lawyers, informing her with icy politeness that any further contact with either himself or his wife, direct or through intermediary, would be treated as harassment and handled accordingly. Pelumi went to the gate herself one final time when Iyabo came pleading that it had all been Ayo's idea, that she had only wanted to protect her family, that surely after everything they could put it behind them. You mean you want to know if the door is still open, Pelumi said. You tried to tell strangers I was a frightened, controlled woman who needed rescuing from my own husband. Do you understand what you actually did, Mama? You tried to take his money. You tried to take my voice and use it to lie about the one person who's ever actually listened to it. I'm your mother, Iyabo said, and for the first time in 6 years, there was something almost like pleading in her voice. You are the woman who raised me, Pelumi said. There's a difference, and I've had 3 months to learn it clearly. She turned and walked back up the drive without waiting for a response, leaving her stepmother standing outside gates that would from that day on simply never open for her again.
Pelumi never went back to that house. She didn't need to. The story got out eventually, not because she told it, but because stories like that always find their own way into the world. Chief Balogun's business dealings, once quietly propped up by decades of careful reputation, thinned out fast once the truth about his nephew's accident and his own son's fabricated conspiracy began to circulate among the men who'd once trusted him. Iyabo's church friend stopped calling. The good sofa in the parlor stayed empty of guests worth impressing. Darius stepped, slowly and on his own terms, back into a version of public life he'd avoided for 8 years. not because he needed the world's attention, but because he no longer needed to hide from the people who'd once controlled it. It was on an ordinary evening, nearly a year after the wedding no one wanted for them, that he asked Ngozi to clear the garden with everything except the 2 chairs by the fountain, and asked Emeka to make sure the gate stayed closed to every visitor but one. Pelumi found him standing there at dusk, dressed the way he had been the very first night. Dark suit, walking stick resting untouched against the chair, though by then she'd long since learned he rarely needed it at all. "You are not on a call," she said, half teasing. "I don't think I've seen you idle in a garden on a weekday in a year." "I'm not idle. I've been waiting for you." He reached into his jacket and drew out a small velvet box and knelt, carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything, in the grass at her feet. "We were married in a hall behind my uncle's house, in front of people who came to laugh at us, and you wore a dress that wasn't chosen for you, and I never once got to ask you the question that actually mattered. I'm asking it now. Pelumi, will you marry me? Properly, on your own terms this time, with nothing hidden and nothing borrowed and nothing anyone can ever take credit for but us." Pelumi laughed, a startled, overwhelmed sound, both hands pressed to her mouth. "Darius, we're already married. On paper, in front of people who wished us nothing. I want the version of this that was never allowed to happen, if you will let me give it to you." Yes, before he'd even finished opening the box properly. Yes, of course, yes. Later, on the veranda, with her hand turned over in his so he could feel the ring settled against her finger, he asked the second question, more quietly than the first. "Would you want to redo it, the wedding? Not small this time, not something anyone can mock or mismeasure or dress you for without asking. Whatever you want it to be." Pelumi was quiet a long moment, thinking of the plain white dress, the wooden stool she was never once offered a cushion for, the small sour hall behind a compound that never wanted her in it. "Yes," she said finally. "I want it big enough that no one who ever made me feel small gets to pretend they weren't there to see it." The second wedding took 8 months to plan, and Pelumi was involved in every single decision of it. The first time in her life anyone had ever asked her opinion on something and actually waited for the real answer. It was held in the gardens of the house that was now unmistakably, publicly, as much as hers as his. String lights woven through the trees Darius had once walked with when neither of them had said aloud what they were becoming to each other. 100 more guests than the first wedding had allowed, and a gown Pelumi chose herself, fitted to her, in a color she picked because she liked it, and for no other reason at all. Ngozi cried throughout the entire ceremony and denied it afterwards. Chidinama stood as one of her witnesses, having become, somewhere in the last year, something closer to family than lawyer. Emeka, in a proper suit for once instead of his driver's uniform, walked her partway down the aisle himself, since there was no father left to do it, and he'd quietly earned the honor 100 small ways over the year. Darius stood waiting at the front exactly as he had the first time. Dark glasses, steady, unhurried. But this time there was no hall full of people who came to mock them, no stepmother whispering to church friends, no cousin standing at the back with his arms crossed, calculating. There was only a garden full of people who had watched, over the past year, exactly what kind of marriage this had actually become, and had come because they wanted to see it made official in the way it deserved. "I remember your voice," Darius said again, when she reached him, the same words from the small hall a lifetime ago. "Now, I remember your hands were steady, that day with the tea. I've spent every day since being grateful they never once let go." "They are not going anywhere," Pelumi said. They danced until well past midnight. Under lights, neither of them had needed to borrow from anyone. The children came in their own time over the years that followed. First a daughter, quick-tempered and stubborn in a way that made Darius laugh helplessly every time she dug her heels in about something, followed by a diligent, laughter-easy pair of twin boys who turned the quiet garden into a permanent racetrack of small bicycles and half-finished games. Pelumi still read to Darius most mornings, though the letters had long since turned to bedtime stories read at 3 different volumes to 3 different children, piled onto one bed, Darius's hand finding each small head in the dark to know exactly who was where in the room. Their daughter liked to sit closest to him and narrate, solemnly, everything happening in the room that he couldn't see. "Mommy is smiling right now, Daddy. The twins are not listening. I am listening." And he always thanked her, gravely, as though it were the most important report he'd receive all day. When a business journal ran its profile of Obi Renewable's famously private founder, the photograph they chose was of him on his own veranda at dusk. Dark glasses, quiet smile, 3 children arranged around him in various states of mid-motion, and his wife's hand resting easy on his shoulder. A family no one built for them, and no one could ever take from them again. Pelumi had found what 6 years in her stepmother's house had told her over and over she'd never deserve: a home where her hands and her heart were finally seen for exactly what they were worth, by the one person who never needed his eyes to recognize it, and by the children who never once doubted it.